The dust from the mountain pass still clung to Garrett Aldridge's buckskin coat when he first saw her through the bakery window, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. She stood behind the counter with white flour dusted through her auburn hair like fresh snow on autumn leaves, her hands working dough with a practiced rhythm that spoke of years spent in her father's trade. The late afternoon sun of September 1876 slanted through the glass, catching those flour-dusted strands and creating a halo effect that made Garrett's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the 3-week trek down from the Wasatch Range. He had come to Moab, Utah, for supplies and solitude, but the sight of this woman made him question every plan he had made for the winter ahead. Garrett pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed above his head. The scent of fresh bread enveloped him immediately, rich and warm and utterly foreign to a man who had spent the last 8 months living off jerky and whatever game he could trap. The woman looked up from her work, and he found himself staring into eyes the color of honey in sunlight. She smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of those remarkable eyes, and Garrett realized he had been standing in the doorway like a fool for far too long. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft lilt of someone raised in gentler places than the harsh Utah territory. There was flour on her cheek, too, a white smudge that she seemed completely unaware of, and Garrett had the strangest urge to reach across the counter and brush it away. "Bread," he managed, his own voice rougher than he intended after weeks of silence in the mountains. "And whatever else you might have that travels well." She nodded and began selecting loaves from the shelves behind her, wrapping them in clean cloth with efficient movements. Garrett used the moment to collect himself, pulling off his wide-brimmed hat and running a hand through his own hair, which fell past his shoulders in dark waves that his mother would have scolded him for. The bakery was small but immaculately kept, with whitewashed walls and a large stone oven dominating one corner. Through a doorway in the back, he could hear the deep voice of a man humming tunelessly. "You are new to Moab," she said, not quite a question, "or just passing through?" "Come down for supplies," Garrett replied, setting his hat on the counter. "Been up in the high country since spring." Her hands paused in their wrapping, and she studied him with open curiosity. Up close, he could see that her auburn hair was pulled back in a thick braid, though many strands had escaped to frame her face, all of them liberally dusted with flour. She wore a simple calico dress covered by a white apron that had seen better days, both streaked with the evidence of a long day's work. There was something ethereal about her, despite the practical clothing, something that made his heart beat faster in a way that felt both wonderful and terrifying. "That is a long time to be alone," she observed, resuming her task. "I am Amelia Rosewood. My father owns this bakery, Garrett Aldridge." He watched her add 2 more loaves to his pile without asking. "That is more than I requested. The extra will not go to waste, I promise you that." Amelia glanced toward the back room, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Besides, you look like you could use a proper meal. When did you last eat something that was not dried or salted?" The question was so direct and so accurate that Garrett found himself smiling despite his usual reserve. "Been a while," he admitted. "Then you should stay for supper." The invitation came easily, as natural as breathing. "Father always makes enough for half the town, and we have plenty." Before Garrett could formulate a polite refusal, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and flour-covered hands emerged from the back room. His eyes were the same warm honey color as his daughter's, and they narrowed slightly as they took in Garrett's imposing frame and the hunting knife visible at his belt. "Who is our guest?" "Amelia." "Garrett Aldridge, sir," Garrett said, extending his hand. Just came down from the mountains for supplies. The older man's grip was firm despite the softness of Baker's hands. Thomas Rosewood, you trap, some, hunt mostly, sell pelts and meat when I come to town. Thomas nodded slowly, his assessment of Garrett thorough but not unkind. Mountain man, then. Do not see many of your kind anymore. Most are pushing further west or giving up the life entirely. He turned to his daughter. Did you invite him to supper? I did. Good. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron. We eat in an hour. That gives you time to wash up at the pump out back, Aldridge. No offense meant, but you smell like you have been living with bears. Garrett felt heat creep up his neck, but there was no malice in Thomas's words, only honest observation. None taken, sir. But I do not want to impose on your hospitality. Nonsense. Amelia was already moving toward a door that presumably led to their living quarters. Anyone who has been eating trail food for months deserves a proper meal. I will set another place. She disappeared through the doorway before Garrett could protest further, leaving him alone with her father. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the back door. The pump is through there. I will find you a clean shirt. Looks like we are about the same size, though you are carrying more muscle in the shoulders. The casual acceptance of his presence left Garrett feeling oddly off balance. He was used to suspicion from town folk, the wariness that came with his chosen lifestyle and the wild appearance that accompanied months in the wilderness. But the Rosewoods seemed to operate under different rules, offering kindness to strangers as easily as breathing. He followed Thomas through the bakery to a small courtyard behind the building where a hand pump stood next to a wooden trough. The evening air was cooling rapidly as the sun dropped toward the red rock formations that surrounded Moab on all sides. Garrett stripped off his buckskin coat and the stained linen shirt beneath it, suddenly very aware of how he must appear to civilized folk. He pumped water into the trough and splashed it over his face and arms, scrubbing away weeks of accumulated grime and sweat. Here. Thomas appeared with a rough towel and a faded blue shirt. Not fancy, but clean. I appreciate it. Garrett dried himself and pulled on the offered shirt. It was tight across his chest and shoulders, the fabric straining slightly with his movements, but it was infinitely better than what he had been wearing. My daughter has a kind heart, Thomas said abruptly, watching Garrett button the shirt. Sometimes too kind for this harsh territory. Her mother was the same way. The past tense hung heavy in the air between them. Garrett met the older man's eyes and saw both warning and resignation there. I am just passing through, he said quietly. I will be gone by week's end. Will you? Thomas's smile was sad. I saw the way you looked at her, and I saw the way she looked at you, like you were something out of one of those dime novels she reads when she thinks I am not paying attention. He sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. I cannot protect her from everything, no matter how much I want to. But I am asking you, man to man, to be careful with her. She has already lost too much. The weight of that trust settled on Garrett's shoulders like a physical thing. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder and led the way back inside. The living quarters behind the bakery were modest but comfortable, with a main room that served as both kitchen and dining area. A large table dominated the space, already set with 3 places, and a simple meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and fresh vegetables. Amelia had removed her apron and attempted to tame her flour-dusted hair, though white streaks still showed in the candlelight. She had changed into a dress of deep green that brought out the gold in her eyes, and Garrett found himself staring again until Thomas cleared his throat meaningfully. They ate together as the last light faded from the windows, and Garrett discovered that the Rosewoods were easy company despite his long months of solitude. Thomas spoke of the challenges of running a bakery in a town as remote as Moab, of the constant struggle to get quality flour shipped from Salt Lake City, of the Mormon settlers who were slowly transforming the Red Rock Desert into farmland through sheer determination and backbreaking labor. Amelia asked questions about Garrett's life in the mountains with genuine curiosity, wanting to know about the animals he encountered and the landscapes he navigated. "Is it lonely?" she asked at one point, her eyes serious over the rim of her water glass. "Being alone for so long?" Garrett considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there is a peace to it too. No demands, no expectations, just you and the mountain and whatever the day brings." "That sounds wonderful," Amelia said softly, and something in her tone made Garrett wonder what she was trying to escape. After the meal, Thomas excused himself to prepare dough for the next morning's baking, leaving Garrett and Amelia alone at the table. She rose to clear the dishes, and Garrett automatically stood to help, earning a surprised smile. "You do not have to do that. My mother raised me better than to sit idle while someone else works," he replied, gathering plates. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising ease. When the dishes were washed and dried, Amelia led him outside to the small porch that faced the darkening street. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage from the surrounding desert. Stars were beginning to emerge in the vast sky above, brighter than any Garrett had seen even in the high country. "Thank you for staying," Amelia said, leaning against the porch rail. "We do not get many visitors, and Father gets tired of only having me to talk to. I doubt that is possible." The words came out more intense than Garrett had intended, and he saw color rise in her cheeks even in the dim light. "You are kind to say so." She turned to face him fully, and in the starlight, with flour still dusting her hair like fairy dust, she looked more than ever like something not quite of this world. "Will you really leave by week's end?" The question caught him off guard. "That was my plan. Plans change." Her smile was gentle but knowing. "Sometimes life has other ideas about where we should be." Before Garrett could respond to that enigmatic statement, a commotion erupted from down the street. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful evening, and Garrett instinctively moved in front of Amelia as three men stumbled out of what was clearly the town saloon. They were drunk and rowdy, shoving each other and laughing too loudly in the quiet night. "Stay behind me," Garrett said quietly, his hand moving automatically to the knife at his belt, but the drunks were not interested in them, weaving their way down the street in the opposite direction, still shouting and laughing. When they disappeared around a corner, Garrett forced himself to relax, suddenly aware of how close Amelia was standing behind him. He could feel the warmth of her presence, smell the faint scent of cinnamon and flour that clung to her skin. "You moved fast," she observed, not stepping away. "Like you expected trouble. Old habits." Garrett turned to face her, finding her closer than he expected. "The mountains teach you to react first and think second. That must be exhausting, always being ready to fight or run. It keeps you alive. But does it let you live?" The question was soft but penetrating, and Garrett found he had no answer for it. They stood there on the porch for a long moment, the night settling around them like a blanket. Finally, Amelia sighed and stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself against the cooling air. "You should come back tomorrow," she said. "For breakfast, Father makes the best biscuits in the territory, and you can tell me more about the mountains. I should not impose again. It is not an imposition if you are invited." Her smile was warm and certain. "Please, Garrett, come back." He knew he should refuse, should put distance between himself and this woman who made his chest feel tight and his plans seem suddenly hollow. But looking at her in the starlight with flour still caught in her hair like captured moonbeams, he found himself nodding. "I will come back." Her smile could have lit the entire desert. "Good. Come at dawn. That is when the bread is best." Garrett retrieved his coat and hat from inside, bid Thomas good night with a handshake that felt like a covenant, and walked out into the cool September night. He had secured a room at the boarding house at the edge of town, a sparse place that smelled of old wood and older regrets. As he lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, he tried to convince himself that he would gather his supplies quickly and head back to the mountains where he belonged. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, his dreams were full of honey-colored eyes and flour-dusted hair, and the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he had not seen coming. Dawn came early to Moab, painting the red rock formations in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Garrett had been paying attention. Instead, he found himself walking toward the bakery before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon, drawn by a force he did not want to examine too closely. The town was just beginning to stir, a few early risers moving through the streets with purpose. Smoke rose from chimneys, and somewhere a rooster crowed its morning declaration. The bakery door was unlocked, and the scent that greeted Garrett was even more intoxicating than the previous evening. Fresh bread, cinnamon, and something sweet he could not quite identify filled the air like a physical presence. Thomas looked up from the large oven where he was pulling out perfectly golden loaves with a long wooden paddle. "Right on time," the older man said with approval. "Amelia said you would be early. She has a good sense for people. I hope I am not intruding. If you were, I would not have unlocked the door." Thomas gestured toward the back room. "She is preparing breakfast. Go on through." Garrett found Amelia in the kitchen, her hair once again pulled back in a thick braid and her simple dress covered by a clean apron. She was working at the stove, flipping what looked like flapjacks with practiced ease. When she heard him enter, she turned with a smile that made the early morning walk entirely worthwhile. "You came. You invited me. I know, but I was not entirely sure you would actually show up." She gestured to a chair at the table. "Sit. Everything is almost ready." Garrett settled into the offered seat, watching her move around the kitchen with the same efficient grace she had shown the previous evening. There was flour in her hair again, fine white dust that caught the morning light streaming through the window. He wondered if she knew, if she was aware of the effect it created, making her look like something out of a fairy tale his mother used to tell. "You are staring," Amelia said without turning around, amusement clear in her voice. "Sorry." Garrett felt heat creep up his neck again. "It is just that you have flour in your hair again." "Oh." She reached up self-consciously, fingers brushing through the escaped strands. "That happens every morning. I have given up trying to keep it clean." "Do not." The word came out more forcefully than intended. "It looks nice." She turned to face him, spatula still in hand, and something flickered in her honey-colored eyes that made Garrett's breath catch. "Nice. Like an angel," he said before he could stop himself. "Like something sent down from heaven itself." The silence that followed was so complete that Garrett could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He had never been good with words, preferring the straightforward communication of action and intention. But the look on Amelia's face, surprised and pleased and something else he could not quite name, made him glad he had spoken. "That is the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said softly, then turned back to the stove before he could respond. Breakfast was simple but perfect: fluffy flapjacks with fresh butter and honey, crispy bacon, and biscuits that lived up to Thomas's reputation. They ate together as the sun climbed higher, Thomas joining them between batches of bread. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from the weather to the challenges of frontier life to the news that occasionally filtered through from the larger settlements. "There is a barn dance next Saturday," Amelia mentioned casually, not quite meeting Garrett's eyes. "The Johnsons are hosting it at their ranch outside town. Most everyone will be there." "Amelia loves dancing," Thomas added with a knowing look. "Has not had much opportunity for it lately, though." Garrett understood the unspoken invitation and felt his stomach twist with conflicting emotions. A barn dance meant people and noise and expectations, all things he had fled to the mountains to escape. But it also meant seeing Amelia again, watching her move and laugh, and perhaps, if he was very lucky, holding her in his arms as they moved to music. "I am not much of a dancer," he said carefully. "Neither am I," Amelia replied with a smile. "We can be terrible at it together." "You promise you will not laugh when I step on your toes." "I promise nothing of the sort, but I will do my best to hide it." Her teasing tone made him smile despite himself. "Then I suppose I should go." "Good." She stood to clear the plates, and this time Garrett helped without being asked. "That gives you a week to practice. I am sure you can find someone in town willing to teach you the basic steps." The thought of trying to learn to dance from some stern schoolmarm or amused saloon girl made Garrett grimace. "Maybe you could teach me," he suggested. "If you have time." Amelia paused in her clearing, a stack of plates balanced in her hands. "You want me to teach you to dance?" "Seems only fair, since you will be the one suffering if I am terrible at it." She laughed, a clear, bright sound that filled the kitchen like sunshine. "All right, then. Come by this evening after we close the bakery. We will use the courtyard out back." The rest of the day passed in a blur for Garrett. He visited the general store to stock up on supplies, spoke with the local trader about selling his accumulated pelts, and arranged for new ammunition to be ordered from Salt Lake City. But his mind was never fully engaged with these practical tasks, always drifting back to honey-colored eyes and the promise of an evening spent learning to dance. When he returned to the bakery, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, he found Amelia already waiting in the courtyard. She had changed into a dress of pale blue that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, and she had attempted to clean away the flour, though he could still see traces of white powder clinging to her braid. "Ready to learn?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "As I will ever be." She moved to stand in front of him, close enough that he could smell cinnamon and flour and something uniquely her. "First, you need to learn the basic positions. Give me your right hand." Garrett did as instructed, and she placed his hand on her waist, the warmth of her body radiating through the thin fabric of her dress. His palm nearly spanned her entire waist, and he was suddenly very aware of how large and rough his hands were compared to her slender frame. "Now I will put my hand on your shoulder," she continued, demonstrating. "And we hold our other hands like this, out to the side." They stood there in the basic waltz position, so close that Garrett could count the gold flecks in her eyes. She began to count out the rhythm, explaining the box step that formed the foundation of the dance. Garrett tried to follow, acutely conscious of his own clumsiness compared to her natural grace. "You are thinking too much," Amelia said after he had stumbled for the third time in as many minutes. "Dancing is not about thinking. It is about feeling the music and letting your body respond. There is no music. Then we will make our own." She began to hum a melody, something soft and sweet that Garrett did not recognize. "Now try again, but this time, stop trying to plan every move. Just listen and feel." He took a breath and tried to let go of his self-consciousness, focusing instead on the feel of her in his arms and the melody she was creating. Slowly, haltingly, they began to move together around the small courtyard. He still stepped on her toes occasionally, still lost the rhythm and had to find it again, but gradually something began to click into place. "There," Amelia said with satisfaction. "You are doing it. I am crushing your feet. Only occasionally." She smiled up at him, and in that moment, with the evening light gilding her features and flour still caught in her hair, Garrett felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. This was more than attraction, more than simple desire. This was the feeling that poets wrote about and men died for, the feeling he had always assumed was exaggeration or delusion. They danced until the light faded completely, and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. By the end, Garrett was not quite stepping on her toes anymore, and the movement between them had achieved a kind of rough harmony that felt right in a way he could not articulate. "You are a better teacher than I am a student," he said when they finally stopped, both of them slightly breathless. "You are better than you think." Amelia had not moved away, still standing close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cooling night air. "You just needed to stop fighting yourself. That is easier said than done. Most worthwhile things are." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw an invitation that made his heart race. But before he could gather the courage to act on it, Thomas's voice called from inside the bakery. "Amelia, time to start preparing tomorrow's dough." The spell broke, and she stepped back with what looked like reluctance. "I should go help him, of course." Garrett retrieved his hat from where he had set it on the courtyard wall. "Thank you for the lesson. Come back tomorrow," she said. "We can practice again. You need more work before the barn dance." He smiled despite himself. "You are very determined to make me presentable. I have a reputation to maintain." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes were serious. "And I want to dance with you properly, without worrying about broken toes." The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both natural and slightly surreal to Garrett. He would spend his mornings and early afternoons attending to practical matters, selling his pelts, arranging for supplies, and making the preparations necessary for his return to the mountains. But as each afternoon stretched toward evening, he found himself drawn back to the bakery like a compass needle to north. He and Amelia would practice dancing in the courtyard as the sun set, moving to melodies she hummed or sang in a clear, sweet voice that made Garrett's chest ache. Between dances, they would talk about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of their lives and dreams with an ease that surprised them both. He learned that Amelia had been born in Ohio, that her mother had died of fever 3 years earlier, and that she and Thomas had come west seeking a fresh start in a place where memories did not lurk around every corner. She spoke of missing the green hills of her childhood, but loving the stark beauty of the red rock desert, of the way the landscape changed with every shift of light. She learned that Garrett had been raised on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, and that he had left after the war that had divided families and shattered communities. He spoke little of those years, the things he had seen and done in service to a cause that seemed increasingly meaningless with the passage of time. But she seemed to understand what he could not say, the need for solitude and space that had driven him into the wilderness. "Do you ever want to go back?" she asked one evening as they rested between dances. "To your family, I mean." Garrett considered the question. "Sometimes. But the person they remember, the boy I was before the war, that person does not exist anymore. I would not know how to be him again." "Maybe you do not have to be him." Amelia's hand found his, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. "Maybe you just have to be who you are now." "And who is that?" "Someone worth knowing." The simple certainty in her voice made something warm unfold in Garrett's chest. Someone kind and careful and stronger than he realizes. He wanted to kiss her then, wanted it with an intensity that bordered on desperation. but Thomas was always nearby, a presence that reminded Garrett of his promise to be careful with this woman who had already lost too much. So instead, he squeezed her hand gently and changed the subject, asking about the barn dance and what he should expect. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures that had the townspeople predicting an extended autumn. Garrett spent the morning at the barber, enduring the man's attempts at conversation and a haircut that tamed his wild mane into something marginally more civilized. He purchased a new shirt from the general store, one that actually fit his broad shoulders, and made sure his boots were as clean as leather worn by mountain living could be. When he arrived at the bakery in late afternoon to escort Amelia and Thomas to the Johnson ranch, he found her waiting on the porch in a dress of deep amber that brought out the gold in her eyes. Her hair was loose for once, falling in waves down her back, and for a moment Garrett could only stare. "You look beautiful," he said when he finally found his voice. Color bloomed in her cheeks. "Thank you. You clean up rather well yourself." Thomas emerged behind her, chuckling at their awkwardness. "If you two are done gawking at each other, we should get going." The Johnsons expect everyone before sunset. The ranch was a few miles outside Moab, nestled in a valley between red rock formations that glowed like fire in the late afternoon light. The barn had been cleared and decorated with lanterns and bunting, and already Garrett could hear music drifting from inside, a fiddle and banjo playing something lively and infectious. Inside, it seemed like half the territory had turned out for the dance. Families clustered around the edges of the barn, children running and playing while adults talked and laughed. In the center, couples were already dancing, spinning and stepping with the kind of easy familiarity that came from years of practice. Garrett felt his earlier confidence evaporate. These people knew each other, knew the steps, knew the unspoken rules that governed social gatherings. He was an outsider, a mountain man who had stumbled into something he had no business being part of. "Hey." Amelia's hand found his, squeezing gently. "Remember what I told you. Stop thinking and just feel." Before he could respond, a woman with steel-gray hair and a formidable presence descended upon them. "Thomas Rosewood, you old dog, and this must be Amelia. I have heard so much about you, dear." Her sharp eyes turned to Garrett. "And who is this strapping young man?" "Garrett Aldridge, madam," Garrett said, doffing his hat. "Pleased to make your acquaintance. A mountain man with manners. Now that is something you do not see every day." Mrs. Johnson's assessment was thorough and not entirely subtle. "Are you here to dance with our Amelia or just stand around looking pretty?" "I am hoping to dance, madam, though I cannot promise to be any good at it." "Good enough." She waved them toward the dance floor. "Go on then. The night is not getting any younger and neither am I." Amelia laughed and pulled Garrett toward the center of the barn. The current dance was ending, couples breaking apart and reforming as the musicians launched into a waltz. Garrett recognized the rhythm from their practice sessions, and some of his nervousness eased. "Ready?" Amelia asked, moving into position. "With you?" "Always." They began to move together, and Garrett was relieved to find that his body remembered the steps Amelia had taught him. He was not graceful, not by any stretch, but he managed to avoid stepping on her toes and kept roughly in time with the music. More importantly, Amelia was smiling up at him with such joy that nothing else seemed to matter. "You are doing wonderfully," she said as they turned. "I have a good teacher. And an excellent partner." They danced through 2 more songs before taking a break, moving to the edge of the barn where tables had been set up with refreshments. Thomas was deep in conversation with several other men, gesturing animatedly about something that looked business-related. Garrett fetched punch for himself and Amelia, and they stood together watching the other dancers. "Are you glad you came?" she asked. More than I can say. He looked down at her, at the way the lantern light caught in her hair and made her skin glow. Though I suspect I would be glad anywhere as long as you were there. Her breath caught, and for a moment the noise and activity around them seemed to fade away. Garrett, I need to tell you something. What is it? Before she could respond, a commotion at the barn entrance drew everyone's attention. 3 men stumbled in, clearly already deep in their cups despite the early hour. Garrett recognized them as the same drunks he had seen his first night in Moab, troublemakers who seemed to make a habit of disturbing the peace. "Evening, folks," the tallest one called out, his words slurred. "Hope you do not mind us joining your little party." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his expression stern. "Pete, you and your friends are not welcome here. We have families present." "That is not very neighborly, Johnson." Pete swayed slightly, squinting around the barn until his gaze landed on Amelia. "Well now, who is that pretty little thing?" "Do not think I have seen her at the saloon." Garrett felt every muscle in his body tense. He set down his punch carefully and moved to stand between Pete and Amelia, his presence a clear barrier. "The lady is not interested," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that anyone sober would have heeded, but Pete was too drunk for wisdom. "And who are you, her keeper? Maybe the lady can speak for herself." "Pete, go home." Mr. Johnson's voice was firm. "Sleep it off, and we will forget this happened." "I am not going anywhere until I get a dance with the pretty lady." Pete tried to push past Garrett, and that was his mistake. Garrett's hand shot out, gripping the drunk's shoulder with enough force to make him yelp. "You need to leave," Garrett said, still quiet but with an edge of steel. "Now." "You cannot tell me what to do," Pete sputtered, trying to pull away. His friends moved forward as if to back him up, but the look on Garrett's face stopped them cold. Years of surviving in the wilderness had honed instincts and reflexes that no drunk could match, and it showed in every line of his body. "I am not going to ask again," Garrett said, releasing Pete with a slight push that sent the man stumbling back toward his friends. "Leave the lady alone and get out." For a tense moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then one of Pete's friends grabbed his arm. "Come on, Pete. This is not worth it." Grumbling and cursing, the 3 men retreated from the barn. The normal sounds of conversation and laughter slowly resumed, though several men positioned themselves near the entrance as if expecting trouble to return. Garrett turned to find Amelia staring at him with wide eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I should be asking you that." She reached out to touch his arm, her fingers gentle. "Thank you for defending me." "Always." The word came out as a promise, and from the look on her face she heard it as such. Thomas appeared at his elbow, his expression serious. "That was well done, Aldridge." "Pete and his friends have been causing problems for months, but they have never had anyone stand up to them quite so effectively." "I do not like bullies," Garrett said simply. "Neither do I." Thomas glanced at his daughter, then back to Garrett. "I think we should leave soon, before they decide to come back with reinforcements. Will you walk us home?" "Of course." They collected their things and said their goodbyes to the Johnsons and other townspeople, many of whom made a point of thanking Garrett for his intervention. The walk back to town was quiet, all 3 of them lost in their own thoughts as the stars emerged in the vast sky above. When they reached the bakery, Thomas excused himself, citing an early morning and the need for sleep. But the look he gave Garrett before disappearing inside made his permission clear. Garrett and Amelia stood alone on the porch, the night settling around them like a familiar blanket. "What were you going to tell me?" Garrett asked, remembering her interrupted words at the dance. Before Pete and his friends showed up, Amelia was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkened street. "I was going to tell you that I do not want you to leave." that the thought of you going back up into those mountains and never coming back makes my chest hurt in a way I do not fully understand." Garrett's breath caught. "Amelia, let me finish." She turned to face him, her eyes bright even in the darkness. "I know we have only known each other for a week. I know it is crazy and impractical and probably foolish. But I have never felt like this before, Garrett. You make me feel alive in a way I have not felt since my mother died. When I am with you, the world seems full of possibilities instead of just obligations and grief." "I feel the same way," he admitted, the words coming easier than he expected. "I came to Moab planning to gather supplies and leave. But then I saw you through that bakery window with flour in your hair, and everything changed. You looked like an angel sent down, and I could not look away." "I am no angel." Her laugh was soft and slightly shaky. "I am just a baker's daughter trying to make sense of a life that keeps surprising her. You are an angel to me." Garrett reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "The only one I have ever believed in." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Garrett could see her pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. When she swayed slightly toward him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world to close the remaining distance and kiss her. Her lips were soft and sweet, tasting faintly of the punch they had drunk at the dance. She made a small sound of surprise that quickly turned into something else, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. Garrett kept the kiss gentle despite the want that burned through him, mindful of her innocence and the trust both she and her father had placed in him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amelia rested her forehead against his chest. "So what do we do now?" she whispered. "I do not know." Garrett wrapped his arms around her, holding her close in the darkness. "I never planned for this, never expected to find someone like you. But you are still planning to leave." It was not quite a question, and the pain in her voice made Garrett's heart clench. "I have a cabin up in the high country, supplies stored, traps set. I cannot just abandon it all. I know." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "And I would never ask you to, but maybe there is a middle ground. Maybe you could come back more often. Maybe we could write letters. Maybe this does not have to be the end. Letters take weeks to reach the high country if they arrive at all." Even as he spoke, Garrett was turning possibilities over in his mind, examining options he had never considered before. "But I could come down more often. Once a month instead of once a season. It would mean more travel, harder winters, but we would see each other." Hope blazed in Amelia's eyes. "We would have a chance to see where this goes." "Is that what you want, to see where this goes, more than anything?" She rose on her toes and kissed him again, quick and fierce. "I know it is fast and probably foolish, but I am tired of being careful. I am tired of letting fear make my decisions. You make me want to be brave, Garrett Aldridge." He kissed her back, pouring everything he could not yet put into words into the press of his lips against hers. When they finally broke apart for air, he rested his forehead against hers and made a promise. "Then I will come back. Every month, weather permitting, I will come down from the mountains, and when spring arrives we will figure out what comes next. Spring." Amelia smiled against his lips. "That sounds perfect." They stood together on the porch until the night grew too cold to ignore, stealing kisses and making plans and reveling in the strange miracle of finding each other. When Garrett finally walked back to his boarding house, his heart felt lighter than it had in years, full of hope and possibility, and the woman with flour in her hair who had turned his world upside down. The days that followed were bittersweet, colored by the knowledge of his impending departure and the joy of every moment spent together. Garrett delayed his leaving twice, always finding one more thing that needed to be done in town, One more evening of dancing in the courtyard with Amelia. One more conversation that stretched into the small hours of the morning. But winter was coming, and the mountains would not wait forever. Supplies needed to be hauled to his cabin before the snows made the trails impassable, and the pelts that would fund his life through the cold months needed to be gathered and processed. Finally, on a crisp morning in early October, Garrett loaded his pack horse with supplies and prepared to leave. The entire town seemed to turn out to see him off, which surprised and embarrassed him in equal measure. He had become something of a local hero after the incident at the barn dance, and people he had never spoken to came by to shake his hand and wish him well. But it was Amelia he was watching, Amelia who held his attention as she stood by the bakery door with her father's hand on her shoulder. When the farewells were finally done, Garrett led his horse over to where they waited. Thomas extended his hand, and Garrett shook it firmly. "You will take care of my daughter," Thomas said, not quite a question. "With my life," Garrett replied. "Good." The older man's eyes were bright with emotion he did not voice. "And you will come back. Every month, I promise." Thomas nodded and stepped back, leaving Garrett and Amelia alone for a final goodbye. She had flour in her hair again, white streaks caught in the morning sunlight, and Garrett memorized the sight like a talisman against the lonely days ahead. "Be safe," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. "Come back to me. Nothing could keep me away." He pulled her close, heedless of the watching townspeople, and kissed her with all the love and longing he felt. "I will be back before Thanksgiving, I promise. I will be waiting." She smiled through her tears. "Go on now, before I do something foolish like insist on coming with you." The thought of Amelia in his rough cabin, trying to survive a mountain winter, was both appealing and terrifying. But Garrett knew it was not yet time for that conversation. So he kissed her once more, swung up onto his horse, and rode out of Moab without looking back, afraid that if he did, he would never be able to leave. The ride back into the mountains was longer than Garrett remembered, or perhaps it just felt that way because every mile took him further from Amelia. The red rock desert gave way to juniper forests, then pine, and finally to the high alpine meadows where he made his living. His cabin sat in a small valley ringed by peaks that would soon be white with snow, a sturdy structure he had built with his own hands from logs cut and hauled over 2 summers. He threw himself into work with single-minded determination, desperate to keep his mind occupied. Traps needed to be checked and reset, firewood needed to be split and stacked, meat needed to be smoked and stored. The days were long and exhausting, and at night he fell into his bunk too tired to do more than wonder if Amelia was thinking of him the way he thought of her. The first snow came in mid-October, just a dusting that melted by afternoon but served as a warning of what was to come. Garrett finished his preparations and began the trek back down to Moab, pushing harder than was wise in his eagerness to see her again. The journey that had taken 3 days on his initial trip, he completed in 2, arriving in town on a cold afternoon with his horses lathered, and his own body aching from the pace. Amelia was serving customers when he walked into the bakery, and the sight of her brought him to a halt just inside the door. She looked up at the sound of the bell, and her face transformed, joy blazing across her features like sunrise. "Garrett." She abandoned the customer mid-transaction, running around the counter and throwing herself into his arms with complete disregard for propriety. He caught her easily, spinning her around once before setting her back on her feet. "I promised I would come back. I know, but I was still afraid." She reached up to touch his face as if verifying he was real. "You came so fast. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine. I just could not wait any longer to see you." The customer Amelia had abandoned cleared his throat pointedly, and they broke apart with matching embarrassed laughs. But as Garrett watched Amelia return to her work, fielding questions from curious townspeople about his return while efficiently completing transactions, he felt a rightness settle into his bones. This was where he belonged, at least part of the time. With this woman who made him want to be better than he was. That evening, after the bakery closed, they walked out into the desert as the sun set, painting the red rocks in shades of crimson and gold. They talked about everything that had happened in the weeks apart, Amelia sharing gossip from town, while Garrett described the preparations for winter and the wildlife he had encountered. But underneath, the casual conversation ran a deeper current, an awareness of how close they had come to never seeing each other again, and a determination not to waste the time they had. "I missed you," Amelia said as they stood watching the last light fade from the sky. "More than I thought possible. I missed you too." Garrett pulled her close, wrapping his coat around both of them against the cooling air. "Every day, every night, you were all I could think about. Is it always going to be this hard, being apart? I do not know." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of cinnamon and flower. "But I do know that having you is worth any hardship, worth any sacrifice." She turned in his arms to face him, her eyes serious in the gathering darkness. "I love you, Garrett. I know it is fast and maybe crazy, but I do. I love you." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. No one had said those words to him since his mother, so many years ago that he had almost forgotten what they sounded like. But hearing them from Amelia, seeing the truth of them in her eyes, made something break open in his chest. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have probably loved you since the moment I saw you through that bakery window looking like an angel sent down just for me." She laughed and cried at the same time, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of salt and joy. They stood together as night claimed the desert, holding each other against the vastness and making promises that neither of them fully understood, but both were committed to keeping. Garrett stayed in Moab for 3 days that trip, helping Thomas with heavy work around the bakery and spending every possible moment with Amelia. On his last evening, Thomas invited him into the small office behind the bakery for what Garrett suspected would be a serious conversation. "You are serious about my daughter," Thomas said without preamble once they were seated. "Yes, sir, more serious than I have been about anything in my life. And you plan to keep coming back, every month. That is my intention." Weather permitting and assuming nothing catastrophic happens in the mountains. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying Garrett with those honey-colored eyes so like his daughter's. "I am not a wealthy man," he said finally. "This bakery provides a living, but not much more. When I die, it will go to Amelia, but that is years away yet, God willing." Garrett felt his stomach tighten, uncertain where this conversation was headed. "Sir, I am not interested in your money or your bakery. I know that." Thomas smiled slightly. "If I thought you were, we would not be having this conversation. But you need to understand what you are asking for if you want to marry my daughter. She is all I have left of my wife, my most precious treasure. Whoever marries her will need to provide for her, protect her, and love her the way she deserves." "I can do that," Garrett said firmly. "I may not be rich, but I have money saved from my years in the mountains. I can provide for a family." "Can you provide from up in those mountains?" "Because Amelia is not cut out for that life, Garrett. She is tougher than she looks, but a winter in a mountain cabin would break her spirit." The objection was one Garrett had been wrestling with himself, lying awake in his bunk and trying to figure out how to reconcile the life he had built with the future he wanted. "I know," he admitted. "I have been thinking about it constantly. And I think I have a solution, though it means changing my plans significantly. I am listening. I could do shorter seasons in the mountains. Trap from November through February, then come down and stay in Moab from March through October. I could hire myself out as a guide for hunting parties in the summer and fall, or work as a tracker for the territorial government. There is enough demand for those skills, especially as more settlers come through. Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering. That would mean giving up a significant portion of your income. It would mean adapting. And yes, the first few years would be lean, but I would rather be poor and with Amelia than wealthy and alone in the mountains. You have thought this through. Every angle I could think of, sir. Thomas stood and extended his hand. Then you have my blessing to court my daughter properly, and when the time is right, you have my blessing to ask for her hand. The relief that flooded through Garrett was profound. He shook Thomas's hand firmly, sealing the agreement between them. Thank you, sir. I will not let you down. See that you do not. The months that followed were the happiest and most challenging of Garrett's life. He kept his promise to return monthly, making the arduous journey from his mountain cabin to Moab regardless of weather or conditions. Some trips were easier than others. In December, he arrived half frozen from a blizzard that had caught him in the high passes, and Amelia had to nurse him through 2 days of fever before he was well enough to travel again. In January, the trails were so deep with snow that he had to leave his horses at a lower elevation and complete the journey on snowshoes, arriving exhausted and bedraggled but determined. Each visit strengthened the bond between them, deepening their love and their commitment to building a life together. They talked about their dreams and fears, about the practical realities of marriage and family. Amelia proved to have a shrewd business sense, suggesting ways Garrett could maximize his income while minimizing his time away. Garrett shared his knowledge of the wilderness, teaching her to read weather signs and animal tracks on their walks into the desert. By the time spring arrived in 1877, melting the snows and turning the high meadows green, they both knew what they wanted. Garrett made his April trip to Moab carrying more than just pelts and a hunger to see Amelia. He carried a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone he had found near his cabin, and polished himself over long winter evenings. He arrived to find Moab abuzz with news. The territorial government was planning a new road through the area, which would bring more settlers and more business. Thomas was considering expanding the bakery, and several families had approached him about teaching Amelia to read and write to their children, recognizing her education and patience. But all of that faded to insignificance when Garrett finally had Amelia alone, walking out to their favorite spot in the desert as the sun painted the rocks in shades of rose and gold. She was telling him about the proposed school, her face animated with excitement when he stopped walking and turned to face her. "Amelia, I need to ask you something." She must have heard something in his tone because her expression shifted, becoming serious and almost breathless. "Yes." He dropped to one knee right there in the red dirt, pulling the ring from his pocket. "I love you more than I ever thought possible to love another person. You have become my home, my compass, the reason I wake up every morning. I know my life is not perfect, that I will still have to spend time in the mountains, that we will have to build our life together piece by piece, but I cannot imagine doing any of it without you by my side." He held up the ring, his hand steady despite his racing heart. "Amelia Rosewood, will you marry me?" For a moment she just stared at him, tears streaming down her cheeks and her hands covering her mouth. Then she nodded frantically, words tumbling out. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." Garrett stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the love and relief and joy he felt. She kissed him back with equal fervor, laughing and crying against his lips. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she held up her hand to admire the ring in the fading light. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "You made this. I wanted you to have something that came from the place that has been my home, and now you will be my home too. We will be each other's home." She kissed him again, softer this time. "When can we get married?" "Whenever you want. Tomorrow, if you would let me," she laughed. "As tempting as that sounds, I think we should give Father and the town at least a few weeks to prepare." "What about June?" "That gives us 2 months, enough time to plan properly, but not so long that I lose my nerve." "You will not lose your nerve. I know." She smiled up at him, radiant in the last light, "because I will have you beside me." They walked back to town hand in hand, and when they announced their engagement, the entire town seemed to celebrate with them. Thomas opened a bottle of whiskey he had been saving, and neighbors brought food and congratulations until the bakery was overflowing with well-wishers. Through it all, Garrett kept Amelia close, still slightly amazed that this incredible woman had agreed to be his wife. The next 2 months passed in a blur of preparations. Amelia worked with other women in town to make her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Garrett made several trips between Moab and his cabin, gradually moving his possessions down to the town where they would make their primary home. Thomas offered them the rooms above the bakery as living quarters, at least until they could afford to build their own place. The wedding was held on a perfect June morning in 1877, in a small church that served Moab's growing population. Amelia walked down the aisle on her father's arm wearing her new dress and wildflowers in her hair. But it was the flower dust, still visible despite her careful preparations, that made Garrett's throat tight with emotion. She looked exactly as she had that first day, like an angel sent down from heaven, only now she was his angel, choosing to bind her life to his. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor through whatever hardships might come. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Amelia with such tenderness that several women in the congregation openly wept. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing and food and more joy than Garrett had experienced in his entire life. Their wedding night was spent in the newly prepared rooms above the bakery, and if Garrett was gentle with his new wife, she met him with equal parts innocence and passion that left them both breathless and amazed. They fell asleep tangled together as the summer stars wheeled overhead, and Garrett thought that he had never been happier or more grateful for the moment of impulse that had led him to look through a bakery window and see an angel with flower in her hair. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment for both of them, learning to navigate the balance between Garrett's need for the mountains and their need to build a life together. True to his word, he limited his time in the high country to the coldest months, returning to Moab in early March to spend the rest of the year with Amelia. He found work as a guide and scout, his knowledge of the territory making him valuable to surveying parties and hunting expeditions. The pay was good, better than he expected, and slowly they began to save toward building their own home. Amelia bloomed in their marriage, her happiness evident in everything she did. She continued helping her father in the bakery and began teaching a small group of children their letters in the afternoons. In the evenings, she and Garrett would walk out into the desert or dance in their small living room to music only they could hear. Their love deepened and matured, weathering the inevitable disagreements and challenges that came with learning to share a life. In the spring of 1878, Amelia told Garrett she was expecting their first child. The news left him simultaneously elated and terrified, acutely aware of all the ways frontier life could be dangerous for women and babies. but Amelia was strong and healthy, and when their son was born in November, it was after a short labor that left the attending doctor impressed, and Amelia exhausted but radiant. They named him Thomas, after her father, and Garrett held his son for the first time with hands that trembled slightly. The baby was tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same honey gold as his mother's. Looking down at this fragile new life, Garrett felt the last pieces of his heart that had remained guarded and careful crack open completely. "He is beautiful," he whispered to Amelia as she rested in their bed. "Like his mother. He has your chin," she observed with a tired smile, "and I suspect he will have your stubbornness. God help us both." She laughed softly, reaching out to take his hand. "We will manage, we always do." The years that followed brought more children. A daughter they named Grace 2 years after Thomas, and another son they named William 3 years after that. Each birth was a miracle, each child a gift that deepened the love and commitment between Garrett and Amelia. They finally built their own home in 1882. A sturdy house on the edge of town with room for their growing family and a garden where Amelia grew vegetables and herbs. Garrett gave up trapping entirely as the children grew, finding that his skills were in high demand as more settlers pushed into the territory. He worked as a guide, a tracker for the territorial marshal, and occasionally as a hunter supplying meat to the growing number of families in the area. The work kept him close to home, rarely requiring him to be away for more than a few days at a time, which suited them both. Thomas Rosewood remained active in the bakery well into his 60s, eventually training his grandson to help with the work when young Thomas showed an interest and aptitude for baking. The old man doted on his grandchildren, teaching them to make bread and telling them stories about their mother as a girl and their father's dramatic arrival in town so many years ago. On a warm evening in 1889, Garrett and Amelia sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard. Thomas, now 11, was helping 7-year-old Grace build something complicated with sticks, while 5-year-old William chased fireflies with the dedicated concentration of the very young. Inside, Garrett knew, her father was napping in his favorite chair, recovering from a day spent teaching Thomas the intricacies of sourdough starter. "You ever miss it?" Amelia asked suddenly, her hand finding his. "The mountains, the solitude, the life you had before." Garrett considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are moments when I hear geese flying overhead or smell pine on the wind and I remember how simple it was, how free." Her hand tightened in his, and he realized she had misunderstood. "But then I look at you," he continued, raising their joined hands to kiss her knuckles. "I look at our children. I think about this life we have built together, and I cannot imagine trading it for anything. The mountains were my escape, Amelia. You are my home, even with flour in my hair." She smiled, self-conscious about the white streaks that still appeared daily despite her best efforts, especially with flour in your hair. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The first time I saw you, I thought you looked like an angel sent down from heaven. 13 years later, I still think that every single day. You saved me, Amelia. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain and become the man I was meant to be." "You saved yourself," she corrected gently. "I just gave you a reason to try." They sat together as the light faded and the children's laughter rang out in the evening air. Grace had finally succeeded in whatever project she and Thomas had been attempting, and both were dancing around in triumph while William clapped and cheered. Watching them, Garrett felt a contentment so profound it bordered on overwhelming. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For seeing past the wild man who walked into your father's bakery, for taking a chance on a life that was not certain or easy, for giving me this." He gestured to encompass the house, the children, the life they had built. "You gave me the same things," Amelia pointed out. "A reason to be brave, a partner to face whatever comes, a love that makes every hardship worthwhile." She rested her head on his shoulder. "We gave each other this. Together." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above Utah's red rock desert, Garrett Aldridge held his wife close and watched their children play. The mountain man who had once thought solitude was safety and freedom was silence had found something infinitely more valuable in the baker's daughter with flower in her hair. He had found home, not in a place but in a person, not in isolation but in connection. And though his life had taken turns he never anticipated, leading him down paths he never expected to travel, he would not change a single moment. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every risk had been worth it to arrive at this place, this moment, this life with the woman who had looked like an angel and loved like a warrior. The children's laughter continued, mixing with Amelia's soft breathing as she dozed against his shoulder, and Garrett allowed himself to simply be present in the perfection of it all. The mountains still called sometimes, whispering of freedom and wildness, but their voices were distant now, drowned out by the stronger call of family and love and the everyday miracles of a life well lived. And when Grace called out that it was time for bed and Thomas picked up his little brother to carry him inside, and Amelia stirred sleepily against Garrett's shoulder, he stood and helped her to her feet, following their family into the house that love had built. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, and through the windows, golden lamplight spilled onto the porch, warm and welcoming and utterly, completely home. Years continued to pass in Moab, each one adding new layers to the life Garrett and Amelia built together. Their children grew, each developing distinct personalities and dreams. Thomas inherited his mother's warmth and his grandfather's talent for baking, eventually taking over the bakery when old Thomas finally retired. Grace proved to have her father's love of the outdoors and a fierce independence that occasionally gave her parents heart palpitations. William, the youngest, turned out to be a scholar, devouring every book that came through Moab and dreaming of attending university back east. In 1895, on a crisp autumn morning that reminded Garrett of the day he had first arrived in Moab, Thomas Rosewood passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 72 years old and had lived to see his daughter happy, his grandchildren thriving, and his beloved bakery continuing to serve the community he had helped build. They buried him in the small cemetery on the edge of town, and Garrett stood with his arm around Amelia as she wept for the father who had welcomed a strange mountain man into his home and trusted him with his most precious treasure. "He loved you," Amelia said when the other mourners had drifted away and they stood alone by the fresh grave. From that very first day, even though he tried to hide it behind stern words and careful observation, he saw who you were, Garrett. He saw the man you would become. "He gave me everything," Garrett replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "His trust, his daughter, his blessing. I hope I proved worthy of it." "You did." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Every single day you proved it." They walked home together through the streets of Moab, which had grown considerably since those early days. The town now boasted a proper school where Grace taught children their letters and numbers, a bank, several stores, and even a small newspaper. The wildness that had characterized the territory in the 1870s had been gradually tamed, replaced by civilization and order. Sometimes Garrett missed the raw frontier spirit of those early years, but mostly he was grateful for the safety and stability that progress brought to his family. That evening, with their children gathered around the table and the lamp casting golden light over familiar faces. Garrett looked at Amelia and saw the girl she had been and the woman she had become. There was silver in her auburn hair now, and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of laughter and worry. But when she smiled at him across the table, he still saw the angel with flower in her hair who had changed his entire world with a simple smile. "What are you thinking about?" she asked later when the children had gone to their own homes and they were alone in the quiet house. "How lucky I am," he said simply. "How one decision, one moment of walking into a bakery instead of past it, changed everything. Do you believe in fate?" Amelia settled into his arms on the sofa where they had spent countless evenings. "That we were meant to find each other. I believe in choices." Garrett pressed a kiss to her hair. "I believe I made the right choice when I walked through that door. And I believe you made the right choice when you invited me to stay. Best decision of my life. Mine too." In 1899, William left for university in Boston, the first of their children to venture back east. His departure left an emptiness in the house that took some adjusting to, though his enthusiastic letters home helped fill some of the void. Thomas married a sweet-natured girl named Rebecca who worked in the bakery, and gave Garrett and Amelia their first grandchild, a daughter with her grandmother's honey-colored eyes. Grace shocked everyone by announcing she was going to Denver to attend teachers' college. Determined to bring modern educational methods back to Moab through it all, Garrett and Amelia remained each other's constant, their love deepening with every shared joy and weathered hardship. They still walked out into the desert on clear evenings, though they did not venture as far as they once had. They still danced in their living room to music only they could hear. And sometimes, when Amelia was working in her kitchen and Garrett walked in to find flour dusted through her silver-streaked hair, he would stop and stare as if seeing her for the first time. "What?" she would ask, laughing at his expression. "You still look like an angel," he would reply, making her blush and swat at him with whatever kitchen implement was handy. The turn of the century found them grandparents 3 times over, with another grandchild on the way. Their house, once so full of noise and chaos, was often quiet now, though it filled up admirably when the children came to visit with their families. Garrett had officially retired from guiding, though he occasionally took hunting parties into the foothills when someone specifically requested his expertise. Mostly, he helped Thomas with the bakery and spoiled his grandchildren with the kind of indulgence only grandparents could provide. On a warm June evening in 1901, Garrett and Amelia celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary by doing exactly what they had done on their first date, walking out into the desert as the sun set. The red rocks glowed in shades of crimson and gold, unchanged by all the years that had passed. But they had changed, marked by time and experience and the life they had shared. "You remember what you asked me," Garrett said as they stood watching the last light fade. "That first spring when I came back with the ring, of course." Amelia leaned against him, fitting perfectly into his side as she always had. "You asked if I would marry you and I said yes before you could finish the question. No, before that. You asked if I ever missed the mountains, the solitude. And you said sometimes, but that I was your home. I have been thinking about that answer." Garrett turned to face her, taking both her hands in his, "And I need to revise it." Concern flickered across her face. "Revise it how?" "I do not miss it sometimes," he said firmly. "I never miss it, not even for a moment. Because every single day with you has been better than my best day alone in the mountains. You did not just become my home, Amelia. You became my whole world, my reason for everything." Tears sparkled in her eyes, catching the last light. Even after all these years, you can still make my heart race. Good, he kissed her softly, because you still take my breath away. Every single day when I see you with flower in your hair, I think about how lucky I am, how blessed, how grateful that a rough mountain man was worthy of an angel's love. I am no angel, she protested as she had so many times before. You are mine, he replied as he always did, the only one I have ever needed to believe in. They stood together as night claimed the desert, two people who had chosen each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded every dream. The path had not always been easy, the years not always kind, but they had walked it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. And as they turned to walk home under a canopy of stars, Garrett Aldridge knew with absolute certainty that he had lived the life he was meant to live. Not the solitary existence of a mountain man, but the rich, complicated, beautiful life of a man who loved and was loved in return. A man who had seen an angel in a bakery window and had the courage to walk through the door. The house welcomed them home with lamplight and warmth, and inside, the evidence of their life together surrounded them. Photographs of their children and grandchildren, furniture worn smooth by years of use, books and mementos collected over decades of shared experience. It was not grand or impressive by worldly standards, but it was everything that mattered. That night, lying in bed with Amelia's head on his shoulder and her hand over his heart, Garrett closed his eyes and offered a prayer of thanks for the woman who had saved him from a life of isolation and loneliness, for the children who had enriched their lives beyond measure, for every moment of joy and sorrow and mundane, everyday miracle that had brought them to this place. And in the darkness, with the woman he loved breathing softly beside him, Garrett Aldridge slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who knows he is exactly where he belongs, with exactly who he is meant to be with, living exactly the life he was meant to live. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing both blessings and challenges. In 1903, William surprised everyone by returning from Boston with a wife, a sharp-minded woman named Elizabeth who had been teaching at a girls' school. They settled in Moab, where William opened a law practice and Elizabeth started the town's first lending library. Thomas and Rebecca welcomed a son, followed by twin daughters. Grace returned from Denver with new teaching methods and enough passion to transform Moab's school into something remarkable. Garrett and Amelia watched their family grow and flourish, finding joy in their role as the family's anchor and foundation. Their house became the gathering place for Sunday dinners and holidays, filled with the laughter of grandchildren and the animated conversation of their adult children. Amelia continued to bake, teaching her grandchildren the same recipes her father had taught her, passing down skills and stories through generations. In 1907, on a particularly cold February morning, Garrett woke to find Amelia sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he asked, immediately alert despite the early hour. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "about how different our lives would be if you had ridden past the bakery that day, if you had gone to one of the other stores for your supplies. But I did not." He sat up beside her, wrapping a blanket around their shoulders. "I looked through that window and saw you, and everything changed. You think we would have met eventually. That fate would have found a way." It was unlike Amelia to be so philosophical, and Garrett studied her face in the dim morning light. "I think we made our own fate," he said carefully. "Every choice we made, every risk we took, every time we chose each other over easier paths, that is what brought us here. I am glad you walked through that door. So am I. Every single day of my life I am glad." She turned to face him fully, and in the cold morning light, He could see the years written on her face, but he could also see the girl she had been, the strength and kindness and fierce love that had drawn him like a lodestone. "I want you to promise me something," she said seriously. "Anything. If something happens to me, I want you to keep living. Really living, not just existing. Promise me you will not retreat back into the mountains and hide from the world." The request sent a chill through Garrett that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Nothing is going to happen to you. We are not young anymore, my love, and I need to know that you will be all right, that our children will have you to lean on. Amelia, promise me." Her hand found his, squeezing with surprising strength. "Please." "I promise," he said, though the words felt like stones in his throat. "But you have to promise me the same thing. If I go first, you have to keep going. Keep baking, keep teaching, keep being the light you have always been." "I promise." She kissed him softly, "though I pray neither of us has to keep that promise for many years yet." They sat together as the sun rose, painting the snow-covered desert in shades of pink and gold, and held each other against the cold and the years and the inevitable passage of time. And when the grandchildren arrived later for breakfast, filling the house with noise and chaos and unconditional love, the somber mood lifted, replaced by the joy of living in the present rather than fearing the future. Years passed, bringing the usual mix of triumph and tragedy. They lost friends to age and illness, watched as Moab continued to grow and change, and saw their grandchildren begin to have children of their own, adding another generation to the family tree. Through it all, Garrett and Amelia remained steadfast, their love the foundation upon which everyone else built their lives. In 1912, on a perfect September afternoon that reminded Garrett of the day he had first proposed, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their entire extended family. The house and yard overflowed with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 3 generations of love and laughter that had all begun with a mountain man looking through a bakery window. Thomas, now grown with silver threading through his dark hair, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us what it means to love with everything you have, who showed us that strength comes in many forms and that the greatest courage is choosing to open your heart even when it is frightening. Dad, you could have stayed in the mountains. Mom, you could have stayed safe in your grief. But you both chose to risk, to love, to build this incredible family. Everything good in our lives started with that choice." Garrett felt Amelia's hand tighten in his as their children and grandchildren raised their glasses in agreement. Looking around at all these faces, this legacy of love they had created, he felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "Thank you," he managed to say when it was his turn to speak, "for making an old mountain man believe in miracles. For proving that angels do walk among us, sometimes with flower in their hair and kindness in their hearts. Everything I am, everything I have become, is because of your mother. She is and always will be the best thing that ever happened to me." The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories told and retold until they became family legend. When the last guest finally left and the house fell quiet, Garrett and Amelia stood on their porch under a canopy of stars, just as they had so many times before. 35 years, Amelia mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. The best forever I could have imagined. Garrett pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of cinnamon and flower that had clung to her for their entire marriage. Ready for 35 more, and then some. She rose on her toes to kiss him, and despite the years and the silver in their hair and the lines on their faces, the spark between them burned as bright as ever. "I love you, Garrett Aldridge, More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. I love you too, Amelia, my angel, my home, my everything. They stood together in the starlight, two people who had taken a chance on love and never looked back. The path forward was uncertain, as it always was, but they would walk it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, just as they always had. And that, Garrett thought as he held his wife close in the cool September night, was the greatest gift anyone could ask for. The legacy of their love would continue through the generations. Stories told and retold about the mountain man who saw an angel in a bakery window, and the baker's daughter who taught him that home was not a place, but a person. But for now, in this perfect moment, all that mattered was the two of them together, exactly where they were meant to be. And as they turned to go inside, Garrett glanced back one more time at the stars wheeling overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, and every moment of joy and sorrow in between. "Thank you," he whispered to whatever force or fate or fortune had led him to walk through that bakery door so many years ago. "Thank you for her." Then he followed Amelia inside, closing the door on the night, and once again found himself exactly where he belonged, in the presence of his angel, his love, his life. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from a life well lived and a love well tended, that he would not trade a single moment of it for anything the world could offer. The story of Garrett and Amelia Aldridge became legend in Moab, passed down through generations as an example of love conquering all obstacles. But for those who lived it, it was simply their life, their choice, their miracle. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift of all.